When I first bought the lakeside property, I thought I had found the perfect escape from city life. The water shimmered like glass in the mornings, birds nested in the reeds, and the sound of frogs at night was better than any white noise machine. It wasn't a big lake, but it was peaceful, quiet, and according to every document I signed entirely mine. I worked hard for that place, and all I wanted was to enjoy a little fishing on weekends, maybe paddle a kayak now and then. But apparently, my idea of peace didn't fit with the vision of the local homeowners association next door. I didn't even live under their jurisdiction, my property wasn't part of their development. Still, that didn't stop them from acting like they owned every inch of land and water within sight of their precious neighborhood. The trouble started a few weeks after I moved in. I was standing by the shore one Saturday morning, coffee in hand, casting a line out into the still water. That's when a woman in a pastel tracksuit appeared at the edge of my property, hands on her hips, wearing the universal expression of HOA authority, a mix of fake concern and barely disguised irritation. She introduced herself as Carol, president of the HOA across the street, and said she just wanted to clarify that the lake was community property and that fishing was not allowed without board approval. I calmly told her the lake was on my deed, that it wasn't part of her HOA, and that I'd appreciate it if she didn't trespass. Her eyes narrowed, and she gave me a tight smile. That's not what our documents say, she replied before marching off. That was the first of many conversations that would end the same way, with Carol making threats about violations that didn't apply to me and me reminding her that I didn't belong to her HOA. For a while, I ignored it. I kept fishing, minding my business, and maintaining my property. But the HOA wasn't done. A week later, I came home to find a bright orange notice taped to my mailbox, an official-looking document with the HOA's letterhead claiming I was in violation of community environmental standards for unauthorized lake activity. It was laughable, but still, the arrogance annoyed me. I sent a polite but firm email with copies of my deed and property survey, clearly showing that the entire lake shoreline, dock, and all was within my boundary. I got no reply. Instead, a few days later, a group of board members came to inspect the area. They stood at the edge of the road, clipboards in hand, pointing at my dock and whispering like a pack of gossiping teenagers. I waved at them, but they didn't even have the decency to wave back. I could tell they were planning something. Soon after that, the harassment picked up. I started getting letters about noise complaints, unsightly property conditions, and even a potential wildlife hazard because I was feeding ducks. Every single one came from the HOA, even though I wasn't under their control. I called the county office to confirm, and they told me exactly what I already knew: the HOA had no authority over my land, no right to issue fines, and no jurisdiction whatsoever. I sent them a certified letter stating as much, complete with legal citations. You'd think that would have been the end of it. But when someone like Carol feels their power slipping, they don't stop, they double down. One evening, while I was cleaning up my tackle box, Carol walked right down to the dock like she owned the place. "You need to stop fishing," she said flatly. "You're scaring away wildlife, and this lake belongs to the community." I stood up, took a deep breath, and calmly handed her a copy of my deed. "This lake is on private property, my property. You are trespassing." She looked at the paper, her face twitching as if she'd swallowed something bitter, then crumpled it in her fist and said, "You'll regret this." Then she stomped away, muttering about calling the county. For a while, I thought maybe she'd finally given up. The HOA seemed to quiet down, and the next few weeks were blissfully normal. I fished, grilled by the lake, even invited a few friends over for a small weekend get-together. But I should ve known it was the calm before the storm. One morning, as the sun rose over the lake, I noticed something strange. The water looked murky, darker than usual. At first, I thought it was runoff from the recent rain, but when I walked closer, the smell hit me. It was chemical, sharp, almost metallic. I frowned and looked out over the water. A few fish were floating near the surface, dead. My stomach sank. This wasn't natural. Someone had done something to my lake. I took a sample of the water and sent it to a local lab for testing. The results came back 2 days later: traces of pesticides and algicides, chemicals often used to kill aquatic plants but harmful to fish and wildlife in high concentrations. Whoever had dumped it hadn't known what they were doing, or they hadn't cared. My first suspicion was obvious. The HOA. They'd been desperate to stop me from fishing, and now the lake was poisoned. My private lake. I went straight to the security cameras I'd installed around my property and reviewed the footage. Sure enough, around 2 a.m. a few nights earlier, 2 figures could be seen walking near the shore, carrying containers. They poured something into the water and left. My first reaction was fury. Then, as I watched more closely, I realized something else. The direction they came from, the path they followed, it led straight from the HOA's maintenance shed area. They had used their own access road to sneak over the fence that bordered my property. The irony hit me hard. They were so obsessed with control that they depoisoned the very lake their neighborhood relied on. Because here's the thing: while I owned the lake, the water table beneath it extended into their subdivision. Their community water feature was fed directly by the outflow from my lake. That meant their lawns, sprinklers, and even some of their groundwater wells were connected to the same system. I sat on the dock that evening, staring out at the dark water, anger mixing with grim satisfaction. They had tried to punish me, but they'd only set themselves up for disaster. I knew what I had to do next. I gathered the water reports, printed the security footage stills, and prepared a file for the local environmental agency. But I didn't submit it just yet. I wanted to give the HOA one last chance to admit what they'd done. So, I wrote them a letter, polite but direct, outlining the contamination, the evidence, and the fact that their water system was tied to my lake. I told them if they didn't contact me within 3 days to discuss cleanup, I'd hand everything over to the authorities. The next morning, I saw Carol standing across the street, staring at the lake with her arms crossed. I could tell by her face that she already knew something was wrong. The sprinklers in her neighborhood hadn't come on that morning, and word had probably spread that the water pressure was low. She must have realized, in that moment, that their problem was about to become much bigger than a petty fishing argument. I went back inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and smiled. For the first time since moving there, I didn't feel like the outsider. I felt like the one holding all the cards and the deed to the lake that powered their world. The morning after I sent that letter, I woke up to the sound of raised voices near the property line. When I stepped outside, I saw a small group of HOA board members gathered with Carol at the edge of the lake, all of them staring down at the water like it had personally betrayed them. The once clear surface had turned cloudy and green, and the smell was worse than ever. I walked down slowly, coffee in hand, calm as ever. Carol turned when she saw me, her face pale but her tone defensive. "Something's wrong with the lake," she said sharply, as if I hadn't noticed. "It's contaminated." I didn't even bother hiding my smirk. "You don't say? Maybe you should ask whoever dumped chemicals into it last week." That shut her up for a moment, but another board member, a heavy-set man with a clipboard, tried to step in. "You don't have any proof of that," he said. "Besides, this is a community concern. The HOA will handle cleanup." I took a sip of coffee and said evenly, "The lake is on my property. You won't handle anything." Then I pulled out my phone and played the security footage I'd saved. As soon as the video showed two figures carrying containers and pouring something into the water, Carol's face turned red. She didn't have to say it, but everyone there knew what they were seeing. The HOA was caught. By noon, word had spread across the entire neighborhood that the lake was contaminated and the water lines were starting to act up. Some lawns were drying out, sprinklers sputtered, and a few residents even reported cloudy water from their taps. It didn't take long for the panic to set in. People began calling the HOA office demanding answers, and the board scrambled to control the narrative. Carol tried to claim it was natural algae bloom, but the local lab results had proved otherwise. I waited another day before making my next move. When I saw a maintenance crew from the HOA trying to set up pumps near the water line, I walked over and stopped them. "You're trespassing," I told them. "You'll need permission from the property owner." The foreman frowned. "We were told this lake was part of the HOA common area." I showed him a copy of my deed and said, "You were told wrong." He muttered something under his breath, packed up, and left. That evening, my phone rang. It was Carol. Her tone had changed completely, less arrogance, more panic. "We need to talk," she said. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding." I told her she could meet me the next morning with the rest of the board, and she reluctantly agreed. When they showed up, I had everything ready: the lab report, the video footage, and printed copies of my property survey. They tried to argue, of course they always did. One of them claimed the contamination must have come from runoff from my dock area. I pointed out that I hadn't used any chemicals and that the direction of flow clearly came from their side. Finally, I dropped the last piece of evidence: the environmental test showing traces of the same pesticide the HOA used on their lawns. The silence that followed was heavy. Carol's shoulders slumped, and for the first time since I met her, she didn't have a comeback. "So here's what's going to happen," I said calmly. "You're going to report this to the county environmental agency yourselves. You're going to pay for cleanup, restoration, and any fines that come with it. Or I'll file the report myself and hand over all of this evidence, along with your names." They asked for time to discuss internally, which I agreed to, though I knew they wouldn't be able to hide anything once the contamination spread. And spread it did. Over the next week, half the neighborhood began to experience water problems. Faucets ran brown, grass started dying, and a few residents even noticed a metallic taste in their drinking water. The HOA tried to cover it up by delivering bottled water, but it was too late. Someone must have contacted the authorities, because 2 days later, a white truck with the State Environmental Agency logo pulled up to the lake. The inspectors spent hours taking samples, walking the shoreline, and documenting everything. When they came to my door, I gave them everything I had. They thanked me for cooperating and mentioned that they'd already received multiple complaints from homeowners whose wells had been affected. It didn't take them long to trace the contamination source back to the HOA's maintenance area. A few days later, I got a call from one of the inspectors. His tone was half amused, half serious. "You weren't kidding," he said. "The HOA used unapproved algaecides. The concentration levels are high enough that we have to classify this as an environmental violation." I asked what that meant, and he explained that the HOA was now under investigation for illegal chemical disposal. That was all I needed to hear. For once, they were being held accountable. I knew it wasn't over yet, but the satisfaction of knowing their arrogance had finally caught up with them was priceless. Of course, the HOA didn't go down quietly. They tried to spin the story, telling residents that I had sabotaged the lake myself to make them look bad. But that lie crumbled fast when the inspectors publicly confirmed their findings. The HOA had not only contaminated my private lake but also compromised the community's water system. The fines were enormous, tens of thousands of dollars, and several board members were personally named in the report. Carol tried to act innocent, claiming she had no idea what her maintenance team was doing, but the investigators found an email chain where she approved the chemical purchase. The moment that went public, the entire neighborhood turned on her. I'll never forget the day I watched from my porch as HOA members gathered in front of the clubhouse, arguing among themselves. People who had once defended Carol were now demanding her resignation. I could hear snippets of conversation, words like cover-up, liability, and lawsuit. It was almost poetic. The same woman who had once marched onto my property to tell me what I couldn't do was now facing the fallout of her own reckless decision. Later that week, the HOA sent me an official apology letter signed by the remaining board members. It was full of legal phrasing and half-hearted regret, but at least it was something. They offered to pay for lake restoration and cover all cleanup costs. I accepted, but only on my terms. I hired my own environmental team to handle the cleanup, and the HOA footed every single bill. During the cleanup, I learned just how close they'd come to causing a real disaster. The chemicals they used had nearly seeped into the aquifer that supplied water to several nearby homes. If I hadn't caught it early, it could have affected hundreds of people. The restoration took months, and every time I saw those crews working under the hot sun, I thought about how preventable it all was. All they had to do was mind their own business and respect property lines. Instead, they let pride and control blind them, and now they were paying the price. When the cleanup was finally complete, the lake returned to its former beauty. The fish were restocked, the water cleared, and nature slowly healed itself. But things were never quite the same for the HOA. Carol resigned under pressure, and a new board was elected, one that wanted nothing to do with me, which suited me just fine. Occasionally, I'd see a few neighbors from across the lake glance over, maybe curious about the man who'd taken down their overreaching HOA without ever raising his voice. I'd just nod, cast my fishing line, and enjoy the silence. After all, the lake was mine, fair and square, and I had proven that no amount of HOA authority could take that away. The storm that the HOA had created finally reached its peak when the environmental agency officially declared the lake contaminated and fined the association for their illegal actions. Their board meetings turned into shouting matches, the residents were angry, and Carol had vanished from public view after resigning in disgrace. You'd think that would be been enough punishment, but karma wasn't done with them yet. I didn't have to lift a finger. Their own greed and stupidity were about to deliver the final blow. After the cleanup began, I started getting calls from nearby homeowners asking about the status of the lake. Most were polite, frustrated not at me but at the HOA they trusted. They wanted to know when their water pressure would return to normal, when they could safely use their sprinklers again, when the neighborhood would stop smelling like chemicals every time it rained. I told them the truth: the contamination had damaged the natural filtration system, and the water table under their homes was still unstable. Until it fully recovered, their supply would be limited. They didn't like hearing it, but deep down they knew who was responsible. Weeks went by, and the HOA's bank account started bleeding from all directions. Fines, cleanup costs, lawsuits from angry homeowners, it all piled up fast. I had copies of their financial filings from public records, and it was clear they were circling the drain. Then one morning, I received a certified letter from the county notifying me that the HOA was requesting temporary access to my property to monitor environmental restoration. I laughed out loud. They wanted to step onto my land, the same land they had trespassed and poisoned under the pretense of monitoring. Not a chance. I wrote back denying their request and reminded them that any further contact should go through my lawyer. They tried to push back, but their leverage was gone. The county backed me completely, and the environmental agency confirmed that my cooperation had been exemplary while the HOA's negligence was the sole cause of the disaster. For once, the system was on my side. By the time summer rolled around, their neighborhood had become a mess. Lawns were brown, property values were dropping, and several homeowners had put their houses up for sale. Without their precious lake water flowing into their irrigation system, they had to rely on costly municipal sources. The irony was delicious. The very lake they tried to keep me from fishing in had been their lifeline all along. I warned them in my letter that their water supply depended on it, but they hadn't believed me. Now they were paying thousands each month just to keep their landscaping alive. Some of them even approached me privately, hoping to make peace, asking if I'd consider restoring the shared water flow once the lake was clean again. I wasn't cruel, but I wasn't naive either. I told them I'd think about it once everything was fully restored and legal responsibility had been accepted in writing. That ended the conversations quickly. They knew admitting fault would destroy the HOA completely. As the restoration continued, I made sure every improvement was documented. The environmental team dredged the lake, replaced the contaminated soil along the banks, and reintroduced native plants to help rebalance the ecosystem. Watching the water slowly turn clear again was incredibly satisfying. The fish returned, the birds came back, and within a few months, the lake was thriving again. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to crumble. The fines exceeded their reserves, forcing them to dip into homeowner dues to pay for damages. That didn't go over well. Residents who had once blindly followed the board now demanded transparency, and when they finally saw the financial records, outrage spread like wildfire. Lawsuits began flying, homeowners suing the HOA trying to shift blame to contractors, and everyone pointing fingers at Carol, who by now had completely disappeared. Around that time, a reporter from the local news station showed up at my property asking for an interview. He'd heard about the poisoned lake scandal and wanted my side of the story. Normally, I avoided attention, but I figured a little public truth couldn't hurt. I gave him the rundown how I wasn't part of the HOA, how they tried to control what wasn't theirs, and how their reckless actions backfired. The story aired 2 days later with the headline, "HOA Poisons Private Lake, Ends Up Contaminating Its Own Water Supply." It spread quickly online, and the HOA's reputation was ruined beyond repair. People in nearby neighborhoods started canceling plans to join their association, and their property developer severed ties with them completely. The fallout was complete. It was during this chaos that the final twist unfolded. The HOA's land charter had been written years earlier when the development first began. I'd always known there was a small easement along the edge of my property that gave the neighborhood limited access to the water for their irrigation line. It was a legal formality, something that had never mattered until now. But because they had violated environmental law on my property, their easement rights were revoked by the county as part of the restoration agreement. That meant they no longer had any legal right to use the lake or its outflow at all. Their water connection was officially severed. I didn't even have to fight for it, the law did it for me. When the notice came through, I stood by the dock, looking out over the now peaceful water, and smiled. The lake was mine again, completely, undeniably, legally mine. The next HOA meeting, according to a neighbor who still lived over there, was brutal. Half the homeowners voted to dissolve the association entirely. The rest tried to salvage it, but without funds, credibility, or access to water, they were finished. Eventually, they disbanded, and their neighborhood reverted to county management. The homeowners were relieved, though many were still angry about how it all happened. Some even came by my property weeks later to apologize for how they treated me before. I accepted their apologies politely. They'd been misled by a few power-hungry people who thought owning clipboards and titles made them untouchable. I wasn't interested in revenge anymore, I'd already won. With the HOA gone, peace finally returned to the lake. I rebuilt my dock, added a small boathouse, and started fishing again. The water was clean, the air smelled fresh, and the quiet was back. Every ripple on the surface reminded me of how quickly arrogance can sink even the most powerful organizations. They had poisoned my lake to stop me from fishing, not realizing that in doing so, they destroyed their own water supply and dismantled their own authority. Nature has a funny way of restoring balance. Sometimes it just takes a little patience and a lot of paperwork. Months later, I got a letter from the environmental agency confirming the case was officially closed. The lake was deemed healthy and fully restored. I stood on the dock with the rod in my hand, the sun reflecting off the water, and thought about everything that had happened. The HOA had called me a nuisance, a rule breaker, a problem. But in the end, they'd proven to be their own worst enemy. I cast my line into the shimmering water, feeling the familiar calm wash over me. The world was quiet again, and for the first time in a long time, it truly felt like mine.